Good evening, listeners, more especially the grade 12 learners. My name is Mpahama. I'm with my colleague who will introduce himself later on now. We are going to focus on mathematics paper 2 examination tips. But before I get deeper into the discussions, let me hand over to my colleagues so that he can introduce himself.
Yes. Good morning, grade 12 learners, as well as our colleagues all over the province. My name is Tuto Masudubele, the colleague of Mr. Mpama here at the district office, and today we will be revising, giving you exam tips on paper 2.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Masudubele. Grade 12, you are aware that on Monday, on the 7th of November, you will be writing mathematics paper 2. Yes, I believe today you wrote paper 1. Now you're going to forget about paper 1. Now you focus on paper 2. Right, we are aware of the mark allocation of paper 2, which is 150 mark for the question, for the paper, and then the duration of the paper is 3 hours. Remember the starting time. You must be seated and ready to start by 9 o'clock. Of course, we are aware that this is a national paper. Right. We are going to look at the mark distributions of paper 2 per topic. We are aware that you will be writing paper 2, which is out of 150 marks. Now the topics, remember paper 2, we've got 4 topics. It's statistics, which contribute 20 plus or minus 20 marks, and analytical geometry. It's a plus or minus 40 marks. We've got the trigonometry, which is a plus or minus 50 marks, as well as Euclidean geometry, which is a plus or minus 40 marks. Only 4 topics, 2 days left, and I believe that today the focus should be only on statistics, Mr. Masudubele, because our learners wrote paper 1 today, which I believe it was a bit heavier on their side. So they need something that they can relax on. That will be statistics. Right, before we look at the components of each topic, let me take you through to the information sheet. Grade 12, very important to know your formulae. Very, very important. Now, what we are seeing now is a formula sheet that will be having on Monday when you write paper 2. Please, you must be able to locate your formulas for analytical geometry as well as trigonometry and statistics. Right now, when you look at analytical geometry now, the first formula there is a quadratic formula that we need it in paper 1 as well as in paper 2. Of course, now we are going to use it in paper 2, but A is equals to P, we know that we don't need that. Tn is equals to A plus N minus 1, we don't need it. And Tn is equals to AR to the power of N. I don't want to mention it is for what. And then future values for as well, I don't want to mention it. Then we have f prime of x is equals to the limit. Let me not talk about it. But now, I'm going to start now with D. D is the distance, you know, it's for analytical geometry. We'll talk more when we get to the topic. That is where now paper 2 starts. It starts from the distance and up until what? Up until now we get to the mean. You saw the mean there, and then from there we've got probability, which you don't need for paper 2, and then of course now we've got now the equation of correlation. Very important that we need to know our formulas. But in Dr. Masudubele, we'll just talk more into these formulas when we get to the topics. Right now, grade 12, please, every time when you start practicing mathematics, make sure that you have your formula next to you so that at least you are able to select the correct formulas. Every time when you make the substitution, then you're able to make the correct substitution. Right now, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Masudubele now to look at the components of statistics.
Good evening once more, grade 12s. Statistics, grade 12s, is a topic that's being assessed in paper 2. It takes 20 plus or minus 3 marks. And the components of statistics that might be assessed, that will be assessed. The first one is measures of central tendency and dispersion. And don't also forget the measures of position as well. In that, those are your grade 11 and grade 10 concepts. We also have bivariate data modeling. That's when you talk about the regression line, your scatter plot, and your correlation coefficient. We also have your regression line analysis, where you interpret information given on the scatter plot as well as on the regression line. We also have our frequency and normal distribution under statistics, as well as data study and representation. Now, data study and representation is more on interpretation of the data that's given in statistics. Now, very important grade 12s, the concepts to revise before you sit down on Monday while attempting to write statistics, which is the first 2 questions, by the way, in paper 2. Grade 10 concepts to revise. First one are the measures of central tendency. By that, we refer to the mean, the mode, and the median. Measures of central tendency, mean, mode, and median. And make sure that you practice enough questions under grouped as well as ungrouped data in measures of central tendency. Secondly, we have measures of dispersion. That's where we talk about the range, the interquartile range, as well as the semi-interquartile range. And I might include under measures of dispersion, I might include the standard deviation as well as the variance as well. They also fall under measures of dispersion. Again, please make sure that you practice as many questions under grouped as well as ungrouped data. We also have our measures of position, which include, above all, your 5-number summary. What do we refer to as under the 5-number summary? We speak about the minimum, about our lower quartile, our median, our upper quartile, as well as our maximum. So that we refer to as the measures of position. And still under that, grade 12s, don't forget about your percentiles, your decimals as well. So please make use, please make sure that you understand the correct interpretation of your measures of position under grouped and ungrouped data.
Yes, in that demonstration, just to come in as well, just to make grade 12 learners aware that when they are dealing with the grouped data, now we are referring to the estimated mean. Very important. Now they need to do that. Maybe when we go deep into that, then we can just show them on how to deal with the estimated mean. Now the other one that must be is when you have even, remember for 5-number summary, or when you determine the quartiles, we need to have what? We need to have odd numbers to some extent. Sometimes we have even numbers. Sometimes when they determine the median, if we've got the even numbers, they include the 2 that they have added. Remember now your mean or your median will be the middle one between the 2, but when you go for the lower quartile or the upper quartile, you included the one that you have added. Keep that in mind. The odd as well as the even have different question on that, as in that must be really indicated.
And just to add on that, on the 5-number summary as well, grade 12s, please remember to arrange your data, particularly when we are dealing with ungrouped data. Make sure your data is arranged either in ascending or descending order. Very important for you to determine your 5-number summary when dealing with ungrouped data. We also have grade 11 concepts as well under statistics, grade 12s, for you to be aware of. And what are those concepts? Please make sure you know how to interpret histograms. And what is a histogram? It is a visual representation of grouped data. So please be aware of that. There are 2 forms to represent your data visually, particularly your group data, is through a histogram as well as through a cumulative frequency graph. So particularly when dealing with group data, make sure you go over as many questions as possible under that. We also have a frequency polygon. A frequency polygon, again, is just an interpretation of your histograms where you draw your line graph across your histogram. So please be aware of your frequency polygons. I spoke about your cumulative frequency curves. Remember, we deal with them under grouped data. And under group data, that's where you have these components. You have your class interval, you have your frequency, as well as your cumulative frequency. Now, more often, the examiner will require you to either find the frequency, having been given the class interval as well as the cumulative frequency, or the examiner might give you the class interval and the frequency, and then requires you to determine the cumulative frequency. Please be aware of the skill in how to determine either the frequency or the cumulative frequency. We also have the variance and the standard deviation of grouped and ungrouped data. Please remember, when determining the variance and the standard deviation of your ungrouped data, this is where your calculator skills are very important. So make sure that you revise, you brush up on how to utilize your calculator to determine the variance as well as the standard deviation if you're given your ungrouped data. Now again, we talk about still under grade 11 concepts. We have our skewness in our box and whisker diagram as well as your cumulative frequency graph. Skewness can apply to both sets of visual representations of your group data. Remember the three types of skewness. We have negatively skewed, which can also be referred to skewed to the left. We also have symmetrically skewed. We also have skewed to the right, which can also be referred to as positively skewed, particularly when analyzing how data is distributed in a given scenario on your box and whisker as well as your cumulative frequency graph. And again, grade 12s, don't forget how to locate outliers, particularly when dealing with bivariate data. On the scatter plot, you should be able to identify which point is an outlier, and again, you should be able to identify an outlier in univariate data by making use of the formula that determines how to find an outlier. Remember, it's an interval that has the lower quartile minus 1.5 times the interquartile range is 2 Q3, which is the upper quartile, plus 1.5 times the IQR. And that will give you the interval in which you have your outliers. Any points that are outside of that interval will therefore be your outliers. Please make sure you know how to determine them with univariate data as well as bivariate data. And lastly, grade 12 concepts to know grade 12s under statistics. Remember, it takes about 20 marks. You must know how to interpret your scatter plots. You must know how to draw your scatter plots. And remember, what are scatter plots? Visual representation of bivariate data. And when I refer to bivariate data, it's that data set that you are given two variables. You will normally be given two variables, and you'll be required to represent the data graphically in the form of a scatter plot. Know how to draw the scatter plot and how to interpret it. And again, know how to draw your regression line on the scatter plot. Remember the equation of drawing your regression line, y equal to a plus bx, where a represents the y-intercept of that least squares regression line, and b is the slope or the gradient of that regression line. And then lastly, grade 12s under statistics, please, you must be able to measure the strength of the association between the two variables that you are measuring, and that we refer to as the correlation coefficient. To find the correlation coefficient, you have to remember your calculator skills. Grade 12s, please go and brush up on that. And the correlation will give you how closely associated those two variables are. Remember your types of correlation. How do you describe correlation? You first describe the direction, grade 12s. Either it's positive or it's negative based on the number you got when calculating the correlation coefficient. Then secondly, you need to comment on the strength of the correlation. So it's either no correlation, or there's a weak correlation, moderate, strong, or perfect correlation. So the value you get when determining the correlation coefficient will give you the direction and the strength of association between your two variables. Make sure that you practice those questions, because more often than not, the examiners do ask how these variables relate in terms of the correlation coefficient. And grade 12, so what we have on the screen, for those that are watching this presentation through our various social media platforms, we have a typical question on ungrouped data. You're given a data set where you are required to determine the mean, and this we are referring to ungrouped data, by the way. So determining the mean, you all know that you have to add all your data elements divided by the number of data elements that are there. Also, there's another question there where you need to determine in this ungrouped data the standard deviation. Remember the procedure of finding the standard deviation on your calculator. And also, you need to find the number of elements that lie either within one standard deviation or below one standard deviation or above one standard deviation or outside of one standard deviation. Remember those 4 conditions when determining how many elements lie either within, outside, below, or above one standard deviation from the mean. Remember that interval and how to interpret that particular interval.
Yes. Okay.
Also, again, grade 12s, for those that are watching, a typical question that assesses the skill of interpreting grouped data. As you can see on your screen there, the first column will be your class interval. As I mentioned earlier, with group data, you'll be given the class interval, the frequency, and the cumulative frequency. It depends on the type of question that was asked in that particular case. But more often than not, you'll have the class interval and you'll also be given the frequency. So please be aware on how to determine, again, the measures of central tendency when given grouped data. Remember how to do that. Particularly the mean. Remember, to find the mean with ungrouped data, you simply add your individual data elements divided by the sum of those data elements. But with grouped data, what happens with grouped data is that you first need to find grade 12s. I hope you can see here on the visualizer. With group data, you first need to find the midpoint of your class interval. And how do you determine the midpoint of your class interval? You add your lower boundary and your upper boundary and you divide them by 2. For example, the class interval given in this particular question was t is greater than 2 but less or equal to 6. So to determine the midpoint, you simply add your lower boundary, which is the 2, and your upper boundary, which is the 6, and then you divide them by 2. So 2 plus 6 divided by 2, that will give us 8 over 2, and which is 4. And 4 will therefore be the midpoint of the first class interval. That's how we determine the midpoint of each class interval. So you simply repeat that procedure for all of your class intervals, and then thereafter, grade 12s, you then need to multiply your midpoint and your frequency. So you then need to multiply your midpoint and your frequency. Remember, the midpoint found in the first class interval was 4. So when you multiply the midpoint and the frequency that's associated with that particular class interval, which is 2, that will give us what? That will give us 8. So the procedure, I want to repeat again, to find the estimated mean in group data. Remember to find the midpoint of your class interval, lower boundary plus upper boundary divided by 2, and then open up another column on your question paper there, on your answer sheet, and then have a column for midpoint multiplied by the frequency. That's when you take your midpoint times your frequency, and then thereafter you add all of your midpoint multiplied by the frequency. You add all of them, and then after adding, you take the sum of the midpoint multiplied by the frequency, and then you divide it. So for the estimated mean is the sum of the midpoint multiplied by the frequency divided by the sum of all the frequencies. Sum of all the frequencies. And then that will give you the estimated mean. So as you notice, the procedure is not the same when determining the estimated mean depending on the type of data that's given. Please be aware of that, and please don't, it should not be a case that you don't know how to answer this particular question on Monday, having given you this tip today on the 4th of November. Please make sure that you know how to find the estimated mean as well. And again, under grouped data, you'll also be required to complete a cumulative frequency column. And normally you provided that column in your answer sheet. to complete. And remember how to complete your cumulative frequency column. Remember what I said. It's either the examiner will give you the class interval and the frequency, and then you will be required to determine the cumulative frequency, or the class interval will be given and the cumulative frequency will be given, and then you will be required to determine the frequency. Please be aware of the procedure on doing that. And from then onwards, you will then be able to represent your group data in the form of a cumulative frequency graph or curve. And we'll provided a grid on where to draw this cumulative frequency curve. Please make sure you know how to plot the coordinates. Remember the x-axis will be your class interval, and your y-axis will then be your cumulative frequency. Know how to choose the coordinates, grade 12s. To choose the coordinates, the x-coordinate of your cumulative frequency curve will be the upper boundary of your class interval, and your y-coordinate will be the value of your cumulative frequency table. So please be aware on how to determine the coordinates of your cumulative frequency graph. And then just in closing, you'll also be required to determine the median, the estimated median, by the way, in your grouped data. So remember, all measures of central tendency, all measures of position, all measures of dispersion may be asked in grouped and ungrouped data.
Thank you. Just to add on this one, especially when grade 12 you sketch the cumulative frequency, very correct upper limits, but remember to ground. Remember to ground your cumulative curve. How do you ground it? Remember, earlier on, Mr. Masudibel indicated that you must use the upper limit as well as the cumulative frequency. Now, when you ground your graph, then it's only at this time where you're going to use the lower limit of the first class. That is the only time that you use the lower limit. In this case, we said the first class we've got t is greater than 2 and less or equals to 6. Then it means the graph will be grounded at what? At 2 as well as 0. Please keep that in mind. It's very, very important. Right, also grade 12s, I will also advise that when you deal with this type of questions, remember, in this case, they will ask you to complete the cumulative frequency. You complete, but in some instances, they would give the cumulative frequency when you will be required to determine the frequency. Make sure that you work at that as well. And the same apply, the graph might be sketched for you, and then you read the information from the graph. Let us make sure that we prepare ourselves in all corners we can think of. It is very, very important. Median, yes, you can read it from the graph as well as the other Q1 as well as Q3. Please, let's make sure that we look at those 5 number summary.
And there we have another example, grade 12s, of bivariate data. Remember, with bivariate data, that's normally where we represent this data in the form of a scatter plot for us to analyze. So we'll be given 2 variables, and we need to determine the strength of the association between these 2 variables, either by drawing a regression line and then finding the correlation coefficient. So that's, for those that are watching, that's a typical question when we deal with bivariate data. Okay. And then also with regression analysis, another typical example of bivariate data, you are required to draw a scatter plot. You're required to determine the equation of the least squares regression line. We're required also to draw the equation of the least squares regression line. And remember, when sketching the graph of the least squares regression line, make sure that you know what the y-intercept is of that particular graph, and that's the value of A, and also determine the mean point. Determine the mean point, so your regression line will then pass through the y-intercept as well as the mean point on the scatter plot. And again, you must be able to determine the correlation coefficient as well as comment on the strength of the association. Also, again, with frequency distribution, remember frequency distribution, we talk about a histogram, a visual representation of grouped data, and you'll also be required to interpret that using your measures of central tendency, measures of dispersion, as well as your measures of position as well. Also data study and representation, that's when you are now required to interpret information that's given. Either information will be given graphically or will be given numerically. Here you're given a box and whisker plot. Remember when we spoke about the box and whisker plot, know your skewness, your types of skewness. Also know where your measures of position lie with respect to the box and whisker plot. So very important that grade 12s. And that brings us to the end of statistics. I'll hand it over to Mr. Mpama to continue with analytical geometry.
Thank you, Ntatema Sudubele. And now we're looking at analytical geometry. I indicated at the beginning that it takes plus or minus 40 marks. Now, the analytical geometry is divided into two parts. The first part is a linear analytical geometry, which is mostly covered in grade 10 and grade 11. And the second analytical geometry, this one is covered in grade 12. Now, in grade 12, second analytical geometry, remember now we are talking to the two circles. The first one is the one that is centered at the origin, and the second one is the one that is centered at any point. And the center of those points, we usually call them as A and B. X is A there, and then Y is B. Right, let us look at a concept that you need to master before you can handle any question on analytical geometry. The knowledge of properties of quadrilaterals is very important. Please make sure that you revise all quadrilaterals. I think there are 6 of them. I can only mention a few. You've got your square, you've got your rectangle, you've got your rhombus, you've got your parallelogram. Please make sure that you revise all the properties so that when we get into the examination, you know that when we say the diagonal bisect each other, what is it that we are referring to? Please make sure that you study those ones. The opposite side of parallelograms, they are equal and parallel. Go and study those ones. They are very important. Right now, the distance formula, remember we spoke about the formula sheet. Now we've got the distance formula in that information sheet. Make sure that we are able to locate the correct formula that talks to the distance. But when you are preparing yourself on the distance, please make sure that you are able to find the distance between the 2 points. Now I'm seeing the distance, but they can also ask the question to say, determine the length of AB. They are still saying the same thing. Please make sure that you are able to locate the correct formula. Right, not only finding the distance between the 2 points, now you can now change it again to say, now if the distance is given, how do I determine the value of X? How do I determine the value of Y? Grade 12, at this time, we must make it a point that we prepare everything that the examiner can ask on Monday. Under the distance, 2 questions. When we determine the length between the 2 points, the second question is when the distance is given, when we are asked to determine the X coordinate or the Y coordinate of a point. Right, the second one then is a midpoint. How do we calculate the midpoint, and then what is the formula for the midpoint? Very important. Now, the mistake that we do when we write down the formula for the midpoint, yes, it's m into x, x1 plus x2 divided by 2 into and y1 plus y2 divided by 2. Now, remember we are talking to the point here. At the end of the day, let us not write m equals to. It's a point. I cannot say the coordinates of A equals to 2 and 3. That is incorrect. Let's make sure that A, the bracket, then write you 2 as well as what? As well as 3. The correct writing of the formulas is very important. Now, what is it that you are expected to know here? You must be able to find the midpoint between the 2 points, very important. And also grade 12, if the midpoint is given, what is it that you need to do now? Remember, we always say, look at all possible questions that you can get. Now, if the midpoint is given, it means now you need now to separate the 2. I usually say the midpoint, the x value, the midpoint is equals to, then the x1 plus x2 divided by 2. Then you do the same with the what? With the y value, the midpoint. Let us make sure that we look at that, and then you must also be able to interpret the meaning of the midpoint in a given diagram. And let me be straight with you, grade 12. How do they ask a question? Right, we will tell you that this is a midpoint. Now, if you have a line segment AB, and then between A and B there is a M, and now they indicate that AM is equals to MB. Let us take note of that. Maybe I can just draw a line here. This is A, this is B, right? Then from there is M. Now, how do they indicate the midpoint? They will just write here, they will indicate that AM is equals to MB. Then in this case, we know that M is a what? M is a midpoint. So please let us make sure that we know how the question is asked. Right, the next concept then will be the inclination. The application nature, finding the other angle related to the angles, right? Grade 12, the angle of inclination. How do we determine the angle of inclination? We need to understand that the angle of inclination is the angle formed by what? By the positive x-axis as well as the line. Then it means you must move anti-clockwise direction. You move anti-clockwise direction. Now we've got two types of the angles. Now this one will be an obtuse angle. How do I see that it is an obtuse angle? It's when the gradient is what? When the gradient is negative. In this case, I might say m is equals to -2. Then I know that the angle will be more than 90 degrees, but less than what? But less than 180. But now the second one also is when the gradient is positive, then you will have your angle like that. Then this will be your angle what? Your angle alpha. Grade 12, the angle of inclination is formed by the positive x-axis and the line. If the examiner says determine the angle formed by the line AB, remember you move from the positive x-axis to what? To the line. Then you get that angles. We remember the procedures on how to determine that. The formula that is tangent of theta is equals to m. Then from there you substitute. Now if your gradient is negative, please make it a point that we've got two ways of calculating that. Right? Then the first thing that you need to do is to substitute your gradient, and then after that, then you say therefore the reference angle is equals to what? Is equals to the inverse of +2. I usually say this is a trigonometric way. Then from there, use a calculator. For argument's sake, then this is 63.443 degrees. Now from there, this is not a theta. The mistake that our learners do when they use this formula, they start writing theta here. This is not a theta. It is your reference angle. Then how do you determine your theta? Then your theta then will be 180 degrees, then minus what? Minus your reference angle. Then you will get the size of the angle theta. The only challenge is only when the gradient is negative. Remember that your angle will be more than 90. Thank you. Right now, I must also say, okay, let me just go to the next one. Finding the equation of a line. Knowledge of a gradient and intercept is very important. Grade 12, make sure that you go through that. Knowledge of the parallel and perpendicular lines, very important. Remember, we usually say for a parallel lines, M1 is equals to M2. It means the two lines have what? The same gradient. But for the perpendicular lines, we say M1 multiplied by M2 is equals to a negative 1. Then I must indicate that the tangent, remember, is perpendicular to the radius. But this one, we're going to need it more in what? In a grade 12. Yeah? In a grade 12 circles. Right. And then when you determine the equation of the circle, I usually say the information that we need is what? Is a gradient as well as what? As well as a point on that line. We mentioned the parallel and also mentioned the perpendicular. We've got a collinear point. What do we know about the collinear points? They have the same gradient. Grade 12, let me just share a scenario here with you. Right, if I've got point A, and then here's point B, and then point C there, then it means the gradient of AB is equal to the gradient of what? The gradient of BC. That is the first option now, but it will depend on the question or on the given information. If I know the coordinate of B and I also know the coordinate of C, and when the question comes, it will say determine the gradient of what? Determine the gradient of AC. But when you look at A, you don't know what are the coordinates of what? What are the coordinates of A? Then it means you can use the coordinates of B as well as the coordinates of C to determine the gradient of what? The gradient of AC. Please, most of the time I saw the grade 12s are struggling with that. If the 3 points are on the same straight line, remember, they have the same gradient. Right, now at the grade 12, we have a circle. Now, under the circle, remember as I indicated earlier on that we've got two circles. The first one is the one that is centered at origin, right? When we talk to this one, right, this is a type of the circle that we are referring to. But now, what is it that I need to know with this circle? The most important question here is to determine the equation of the circle, right? My next question then will then be, what do I need to determine the equation of the circle? I only need two things. Right. The first one, I need to make sure that I have the radius. I need to make sure that I have the radius. If the radius is 5, then it's easy for me to determine the equation of what? The equation of the circle, because you remember from the formula, you have x squared plus y squared is equals to r squared. Then what is it that you're going to do? You only substitute r by what? R by 5. And remember, you must write exponent 2 to that. And then you simplify. It becomes what? It becomes 25. That is the first scenario. The second scenario then will be when you are given a point. Every time when they ask you to determine the equation of the circle, check what are the given information. Do I have the radius? If the radius is not there, do I have a point? Now, what is it that you're going to do with a point? Then if we've got the point here, the coordinates of the point there is a 4 as well as 3. Then it means I don't have a r. I need to calculate the value of r, the length. Then how do I do that? You just substitute your x as well as your what? As well as your y into the formula. Then remember the formula, x squared plus y squared is equals to r squared. Then what is the x? X there is a 4. Then put everything in the bracket. It's a 4 squared plus 3 squared is equals to r squared. Then your 4 then can use a calculator. You end up with 25 is equals to r squared. Then from there, you can then substitute it back into the formula, x squared plus y squared is equals to 25. That is what you need. What is it that I need to determine the equation? You need the radius as well as what? If the radius is not given, then you need to have what? You need to have a point. Right, the second one is when you are given a center. Remember, we said the one centered at origin, the other one is centered at any point. What is the formula that we are using for that one? The formula is x minus a squared plus y minus b all squared is equals to r squared. Then what are the coordinates of center? It's a as well as what? A as well as b. Very important. You can also get a question that talks to what? Ax squared plus bx plus cy squared plus dy plus e is equals to 0. Very important. Now, I know the center radius. That one I'm fine with it. I can read the center. I can also read the radius. But now, if it is given in this format, what is it that we need to do? You remember you spoke to the completing of the square in grade 11. Now you need it. You need to complete the square to make sure that you can now write this equation in the format x minus a all squared plus y minus b all squared is equals to r squared. Now how to do that? You complete the square. The first step, group the like terms together, the one with x together and the y's together. Then you take the constant on the other side. Then it will work right. Remember, when you add something this side, you must also do it on the right hand side. Thank you. Right, the equation of a tangent to the circle. Remember, I always ask myself, what is a tangent? A tangent is a line that touches a circle at one point. Then we are referring to the tangent. Now, you need to know how to determine the equation of the tangent. I mentioned earlier on that the tangent is perpendicular to the radius, right? If I've got a circle, then this is my tangent there. Then remember now that a tangent is always perpendicular to what? Is always perpendicular to the radius. So it means you will have the coordinates of the center and will have the coordinates of the point of the contact. Then we can use the 2 to determine the gradient of the radius by using the formula. Then from there, you can use the fact that if the two lines are perpendicular, then m1 m radius multiplied by m tangent is equals to -1. Then from there you can determine the what? You can determine the gradient of the tangent. Right. Let's look at the common questions for grade 11. Usually it's grade 10 and grade 11. You will be asked to prove that the angle is 90 degrees or is perpendicular. Then what do I do here? For you to prove 90 degrees, it means you must prove that when you take the gradient of the first line, multiply the gradient of the second line, it must give you what? -1. Then we say the two lines are perpendicular. Please, grade 12s, let us avoid. Immediately you write m1 multiplied by m2 equals to -1. You are already concluding that the two lines are perpendicular. But if you are asked to prove, determine the gradient of the first line, multiply with the gradient of the second line, then substitute in the information and then get it, the answer is -1. That's when then now you can conclude to say, okay, line AB is perpendicular to line BC. Then the angle there is 90 degrees. Right, they ask you to prove or show that the line 1 bisected the line 2, and then also you can be asked to prove that line 1 is parallel to line 2, and then find the unknown if one gradient is given with a parallel or perpendicular. These conditions, grade 12, we need to look at it, especially when you are asked to determine the equations. Please check. If you don't have 2 points, you have only 1 point on the line. Check if they did not mention the parallel or perpendicular. Find the unknown if points are collinear. We spoke to that. And then does a point lie inside or outside the circle or in a line? Remember, you are given the equation, you just substitute the x or you substitute the y. If when you substitute the x, whatever you get is the same as the y coordinate that we're having, then that point is on the line or it's on the circle. Angle of inclination and its application, very important, and I always say grade 12, when you're dealing with the angle of inclination, please make sure that the figure that is given, the diagram that is given, you always try to form a triangles, because we know the sum of the angle in the triangles, we also know the exterior angle of a triangle. Right, the common questions for grade 12, the coordinates of the center, we must be able to master that. We must also be able to read it from the graph or from the equation. The length of the radius of the circle, very important, and also you must be able to determine the equation of the tangent. I spoke to that, where you need the gradient of the radius, multiply the two, because the two lines are perpendicular, and then you substitute into the equation of the circle, which is y is equals to mx plus c. Then from there, they can ask you to determine whether the two circles touch, intersect, or do not touch. What is it that you need to do there? Very important, you calculated the distance between the centers. You have two circles, calculate the distance between the two centers, and then you compare it with the sum of the radii of the two circles. It means I will have the radius of the first circle plus the radius of the second circle. Now, I just compare the two. If the distance between the two is equals to R1 plus R2, then the two circles, they will touch. But if R1 plus R2 is greater than the distance between the two circles, then it means the two circles intersect. But if the distance is greater than R1 plus R2, then they do not touch. Please let us look into that. These are the typical questions, grade 12. Please take scenario questions. I always say take plus or minus 3 different questions on analytical geometry. This is how the question was asked in 2021. In 2020, this is how the question was asked. We're not going to go through all these questions. And now, if, for an example, look here, you've got the diameter A. The coordinates of diameter is B, minus 2 and 6. The coordinates of D there, 0 and 8. Then you ask to determine the center, which is the midpoint. Then we use the midpoint formula. Right, now, this will be the last one. Then I can hand over to Mr. Masudi Bede now to take us through the components of the trigonometry.
Good evening, grade 12s once more. Now, with trigonometry, grade 12s, it's a topic that takes about 50 marks. It's a topic that takes about 50 marks, grade 12s. So it takes about a third of your paper in paper 2, 33% just on trigonometry. Now, trigonometry is generally divided into 3 parts. The first part is your general trigonometry, which requires the use of your trigonometric ratios, your identities, equations. They can be specific or general equations, as well as the use and interpretation of your double angle and compound angle identities, as well as your application of negative angles. Remember, in trigonometry, the main concept with trigonometry is all about working with positive acute angles. So whenever you get an angle that's negative, remember the skill on how to express that negative trigonometric angle as a positive acute trigonometric angle. So remember that as well. Now part 2 deals with your trigonometric functions. That's where you're now required to sketch the graphs of your sine, cosine, and your tangent function, as well as how to interpret the sketches of those 3 trigonometric functions. Be aware that will also be assessed in paper 2, your trigonometric functions, sketching and interpreting your trig functions. And then lastly, grade 12s, you'll also be assessed on your ability to solve 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional questions using triangles in trigonometry. And that's where you're mainly going to use your area rule, sine rule, your cosine rule, as well as your definitions of your trig ratios. Now, concepts to revise before you write on Monday. Your trigonometric ratios. Sine of an angle is equal to the opposite side divided by the hypotenuse. Remember your definitions. Cos of an angle is equal to the adjacent side divided by the hypotenuse in a right angle triangle. And the tangent of an angle is equal to the opposite side divided by the adjacent side in a right angle triangle. Remember, mainly your trig ratios work mainly, your definitions work mainly in your right angle triangles. And then your use of your identities, your quotient identity, as well as your square identity. The quotient identity, which tells us that the tan of an angle is equal to sine of an angle divided by cos of the very same angle. And the square identity is when we have sine squared of an angle plus cos squared of an angle. That we know will always give us 1. Remember the use of both identities, quotient and square identity. Again, grade 12s, very important. Not everything is being given to you on the formula sheet. The reduction angle formulae are not on the formula sheet. And I bet there will be questions that require the use of your reduction angle formulae. So make sure that you master the diagram. You know where each angle is located in each quadrant. So my advice, when you get your question paper, in the 10 to 15 minutes before you write down, before you start writing your paper 2, make sure that you have your, you copy down your reduction angle formula. Remember, you have memorized it. Make sure you have it on your formula sheet, because you will be required to use your reduction angle formulae as well as your co-function angle formulae. Very, very, very important, grade 12s. Again, your use of compound and double angle identities. These 2 identities are on the formula sheet. So please make sure that you know how to expand your double and compound angles, and also how to express those identities as a single trigonometric term. So please make sure you know how to expand, and also how to go back to the compound angle form or the double. Angle needs to lie between a particular interval that's given by the examiner. That's a specific solution. If it's a general solution, the interval will not be given. Please be aware of that. And when solving general solutions, remember the period of your 3 trigonometric functions. For sine, the period of the parent function is 360 degrees. For cos of the parent function is 360 degrees. And for tangent of the parent function is 180 degrees. Please remember the period when dealing with the general solution. And again, sketching, this is part 2. Remember, I said the 3 parts, general trigonometry, graphs, as well as dimensions. Part 2 requires you to sketch the graphs of all 3 functions, as well as interpreting a given sketch. Make sure you go through that. They will be assessed on Monday. And then you'll be required to make use of your sine, cosine, and area rule formulae to solve 2- and 3-dimensional problems in trigonometry, and those 3 formulae are on the formula sheet. So it's quite important for you to make use of the formula sheet when attempting to answer these questions in trigonometry. Now, typical questions that require general trigonometry under part 1, under general trigonometry. There are questions that require you to locate the terminal arm. So there are basically 3 scenarios in which you can locate the terminal arm. The first scenario, for those that are watching on our social media platforms, is when your trig expression is given. You are given a trig expression, and you'll also be given an interval. The interval will also be given. So for those that are listening, you'll be given a trig equation, 17 sine theta is equal to 8. What's important here, the angle is not given, and you are given the interval in which the angle lies. So what's important for you to do here? Isolate your trig expression, your trigonometric function. Make sure you isolate it. So as you isolate it, you'll then have your ratio. Once you have your ratio, then it's quite important for you to locate the terminal arm in which the right angle triangle will be drawn. The correct quadrant in which the terminal arm will be positioned for you to draw your right angle triangle. So remember, you're dealing with your CAS diagram. We all know where each trigonometric expression is positive. Because we have a positive ratio, you check which quadrants is that particular trig function positive. In this case, we have sine of theta equal to 8 over 17. We check where is sine positive. It's positive in the first and second. And you then also check the interval where the angle is located. The interval here, they tell us that our angle should lie between 90 and 270. So I then indicate on my Cartesian plane where the angle is located, and then you'll know exactly where the terminal arm will be positioned. Your terminal arm will therefore be positioned in the second quadrant. Once you know where the terminal arm is with respect to your Cartesian plane, then you complete your right angle triangle. Very important. To complete your right angle triangle, it should always be perpendicular to the x-axis. Irrespective of the quadrant you are in, make sure your right angle triangle is perpendicular only to the x-axis. That's where you form your right angle triangle, and then you complete all the sides of that particular angle. I'm not going to solve this question, grade 12s, but I was just making you aware of the first scenario. The second scenario, grade 12s, is when the angle is known, but the ratio is unknown. You'll be told that sine of an angle or cos or tan of an angle is equal to an unknown. So in this case, we have sine of 43 is equal to an unknown. If you notice, an angle is known, the ratio is not known. That's where you still need to locate your terminal arm, but your terminal arm here will therefore be in the first quadrant, because in the first quadrant, that's where you have that particular acute angle, which is 43 degrees. And normally these types of questions, when the angle is known and the ratio is not known, that's when you need to determine in terms of that unknown variable that's given in that particular question. That's scenario number 2. Scenario number 3, grade 12, the last one. That's when the examiner gave you the quadrant in which the terminal arm is located. The examiner will tell you the terminal arm perhaps will be in the third quadrant, and you'll be given the coordinates of the end point of that particular terminal arm, perhaps -4 and -6. And then you'll be required to then answer questions based on the location of that particular terminal arm. In this case, the examiner was quite generous to you. The examiner gave you the terminal arm. Yours is just to complete a right angle triangle. And remember, to complete a right angle triangle, always perpendicular to the x-axis. Those are the three types of scenarios you have when locating the terminal arm. Make sure you go through all of them, grade 12s. The examiner will then ask you about one of them. So please don't be surprised on Monday when such questions arise. And then grade 12s, the use of your reduction angle formulae as well. You'll be required to reduce all your angles, especially when simplifying trigonometric expressions. The main idea with simplifying trigonometric expressions is all about reducing your angles to an acute angle, a positive acute angle. That's where you make use of your reduction angle formulae. Please be aware also how to make use of your compound and double angle formulae, and as well as how to prove identities, proving the left hand side is equal to the right hand side. Normally with those types of questions, choose the side you are able to manipulate the most and simplify that up until you get what's on the other side. That will either be the left hand side or the right hand side. Again, a typical question for those that are watching that requires interpretation of your trigonometric functions. A sketch is given and you're required to find your period, your amplitude. You're also required to shift. Basically, when I mean by shifting, you're required to transform those particular graphs, either by translation or reflection. Remember how to translate your graphs, left, right, up and down, which parameters speak to that, and also how to reflect across the x-axis as well as the y-axis. And then another typical example of a three-dimensional problem, which is part 3 of trigonometry. You'll be required to make use of your definitions, your trigonometric ratios, as well as your rules, area rule, sine rule, as well as the cosine rule. So please make sure that you go through as many of those questions as possible. And one thing about your 2D and 3-dimensional problems, I don't longer regard them as your level 4 questions, your problem-solving questions, because they're now routine. They've been appearing since 2013 to date. So please make sure that you know on how to solve 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional questions. Thank you. I'll give it over to Mr. Mpama to outline Euclidean geometry.
Thank you, Ndata Masudubele, and good evening again, grade 12s. Now, in terms of Euclidean geometry, remember we've got plus or minus 40 marks as we indicated earlier on. We've got the second Euclidean geometry, mainly is a grade 11 work, and then for grade 12, we've got the similarity as well as proportionality theorem. Right, what is important here is that you must be able to state the theorem in words. Very important, grade 12. You must be able to state the theorem in words, because in some instance you will be asked to complete the statement. Now, if you are not ready in that case, then it means you lose that 1 mark, which for us, we say it should be a knowledge on your side. Right, the second one, you need to know how to prove the theorems. They are the theorems that are examinable. For grade 11, we've got 4 theorems, and then for grade 12, we've got 2 theorems. Please make sure that every day, today you can do 2, I will give you those theorems, and then tomorrow you do another 2. And you cannot afford to lose the 2 marks. And then the last one then is, you must be able to apply the theorem to solve the riders and give the correct acceptable reasoning. For now, every time when you do Euclidean geometry, have acceptable reasoning next to you so that you can be able to know how to write it correctly. Right. These are the examinable theorem. I'm not going to read the statement as it is, but please make sure that you go into your textbooks and then you look at the correct theorem. Grade 11, there are 4. It's a line drawn from the center of the circle perpendicular to the chord. That is the first theorem. And the second one, we say it's angle at the center is twice angle at the circumference. Very important. And then the third one is the opposite angle of a cyclic chord. And then the last one for grade 11 will be a tan chord. Please make sure that you know how to prove all of them. Very important. Now for grade 12, it's proportionality as well as the similarity. Grade 12, please make sure that you can also draw these 2 theorems. The line drawn parallel to one side of a triangle divides the other 2 sides, proportional. And then the angular triangles also are similar. Right now, before I pass this one, I must indicate, if you are asked to prove a theorem, what is it that you need to do? Very important, number one, your construction. Your constructions, please do your constructions on your answer book, not on the question paper. Do your construction on the answer book, and then you can write it in words. But what's important is the first thing that you need to indicate is to have your constructions on the answer book. Then from there you can start with your proof, because you can prove it nicely, but if the construction is not there, then you're going to lose all the marks. Please make sure that you work on that. Right. Usually when we deal with Euclidean geometry, we group the theorem according to the group. We have the groups that talk to the center of the circle. Then please be able to identify those groups and write them down. Because you usually say when you read the circle, when you read the statement, once they mention that a circle centered at O, we always stop. Can you recall the theorem that talks to the center? You write them down, then you check if you can identify one of them on the given diagram. The second theorem, the second group, is a cyclic quad. We usually say this one's talk to the 4 points on the circle. Which theorem talks to that? Opposite angle of a cyclic quad, exterior angle of a cyclic quad, and angle on the same segment. Please make sure that you can identify that from the sketch. And then the third group then will be the theorems that talks to the tangent. The theorem that talks to the tangent is a tan chord, tangent perpendicular to the radius, and tangent drawn from the same points. Grade 12, have the group ready. Always, when you read the statement, please make sure that whatever you are seeing, complete it on your answer book. Very important. I usually say, make sure that your diagram is dated. Don't leave it as clean as the way you are getting the question paper. Make sure that it is dated. And remember, every time your statement must be accompanied by the reason. That is very, very important. Right. These are the typical questions that you are having for Euclidean geometry. 8.1, there it is, the proof. Please, like I indicated earlier on, your construction for the first question is very, very important. Right. For 8.2, I indicated in the diagram below, O is the center of the circle. You immediately go to the sketch. Right, what do you see? There is which theorem that talk to the center that you can locate it there. I can see angle at the center is twice angle at the circumference. Immediately now indicate to some extent you write the reason so that when you go forward, then if it happens that you forget the reason, then at least the reason is written down. Please make it a point that you write everything down. Then you carry on. P, Q, R, and S are points on the circumference of the circle. Which theorem talks to 4 points on the circle? Then you can now indicate the theorem. Please, grade 12, I said write the statement. Your statement must be accompanied by what? By the reason. How do you prove for a cyclic quad? Very important. How do you prove for a cyclic quad? It means if when I add the opposite angles, if they give me 180, then that is a cyclic quad. That is the first one. The second one will then be if the exterior angle is equals to the opposite interior angle. Then that will be the second scenario. Then the third one then will be angles in the same segment. If they are equal, then you have your cyclic quad. Always look at the scenario that is given to you. Right, this is another question also. I also indicated that you must be able to know how to state the theorem. Look at 7.1 for example, if you are looking at this one on our visual. Then the angle subtended by a chord at the center of the circle is. That is a free 1 mark. Now you need to recall it there, you need to recall the theorem and be able to state it in word. Right. We also have the grade 12 now, proportionality as well as similarity. Grade 12, remember, for similarity, you must be able to prove that the two triangles are similar. Very, very important. Then from there, if you are given the scenario like 10.2, says prove that RT is equals to WR multiplied by RP divided by RS. The first thing that you need to do is to identify the two triangles that you're dealing with. Very important. And then after, once you have done, then you can now be able to prove if the two, in fact, you should be able to prove that these two triangles are similar. And what makes the two triangles to be similar? Then you give the reason. Usually we give the first statement and the reason. . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . The two triangles are similar. Let's keep that in mind, because I remember the last time we had it, it was, I think, 3 or 4 years back. Now, the chances are very high that we can also get it on Monday. Let's make sure that we prepare ourselves on that. That is Euclidean geometry for your grade 12, plus or minus 40 marks. Remember, especially the question that we're expecting that everyone should get marks on are those questions that are numericals, as well as the question that will ask you to determine the angles in terms of x or in terms of t. It will depend on the question. Right. Quickly now, before we leave, I think you should be prepared, and before you go to the examination, what is it that we're expecting from you before and during the examination?
Grade 12 is very important, time management. Make sure you arrive in time to the examination room. Make sure you are calm. Grade 12, when you approach your paper, have enough sleep, approach that paper calmly so. Make sure when you get that question paper, already identify which questions you are going to start with. Remember, you are allowed to start with any question in the question paper. So make sure you start with those that you are confident with, and then end with those you are quite a bit unsure about. So that by the time you submit your answer sheet, you know that you have scored marks in the questions that you are confident in. Again, grade 12s, make sure that you have your calculator, ruler, your pens. Don't go with one pen in the exam room. Have at least 3. In case one pen fails, you're able to use the other. And then grade 12s, have your 8 hours of sleep, eat properly, relax, stable conditions, and then the paper structure will be done by my colleague here, by Mr. Mpama.
Thank you, Dr. Masudibele. Remember, grade 12, now 55% of questions will be easy and predictable. Now, this 55, we get it from the knowledge. Remember the cognitive level. We get it from the knowledge as well as the routine procedures. Very important. Then the 30% will be challenging, which then will be from the complex. And then 50% then we'll get it from non-routine, which we call it the problem solving. It's not that difficult, remember. Those questions are unforeseen. We haven't seen that question before. It is recommended, like my colleagues indicated earlier on, that please start with the easy question. The good thing about paper 2 is that you have answer book. The good thing about paper 2 is that you have answer book. Then you can start with any question, any sub questions. Then later on, once you are done with the ones that are easy, then you can now go to those ones that are challenging. The use of answer book grade 12 is very important. I must indicate that there is an additional space at the end of that paper. Please make sure that you use the additional space in a case where you see that this 1.1.2 cannot fit in this space, depending on my writing. Then you can just write it at the back and then indicate, please check the additional space so that we don't lose any marks. Remember, always the instruction will say answer only does not necessarily mean that you get a full mark. Let us make sure that we show all the steps. Right. The use of the calculator, especially in the statistics, grade 12, make sure that you know the calculator that you are using. It's very important. Statistics, 80%, 90% requires you to use the calculator. But in trigonometry, there are those questions that will say, do not use the calculator. Please, let us make sure that we do what? We follow the instructions. Thank you. That is the end of our presentation. Thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Masudibele, for really accompanying me to do the presentation.
Thank you, grade 12s. We wish you all the best. The first paper is done. Now it's up to you now to maximize your marks in paper 2. Wish you all the best. Good luck. Do your best.
We are going to give you questions that you really need to do, and then remember, you're going to respond to these questions from the social media. And the question reads, we've got a Euclidean geometry question here. In the diagram below, O is the center of the circle. In the diagram below, O is the center of the circle. P, Q, R, and S are points on the circumference of the circle. T, O, Q is a straight line such that T lies on PS. And PQ equals to QR, angle Q1 is equals to X. I think you've got the sketch. We'll try to make sure that we avail the diagrams on the social media as well. Your answer, I think it's only 3 questions. 8.2.1, calculate with the resin angle P1 in terms of X. And then 8.2.2, show that TQ bisect angle PQR. Show that TQ bisect angle PQR. And then the last question, which is 8.2.3, it says show that STOR is a cyclic quad. Those are the 3 questions that we expect you to respond. There are nice prizes there that you will get if you get the questions right. Thank you very much. We wish you a good luck for your examinations. Thank you.